put into focus all that's happened with Trump's statement. In fact, let me also take the opportunity to be welcoming our other guest, Professor Madhav Nalapat, Vice Chair, Manipal Advanced Research Group, joining us over the phone lines. Professor Nalapat, thank you very much for joining us here on ET. Now, let me begin with the fact that how are you reading into this statement of what Trump has said, that China and India are the primary funders of Russia's war on Ukraine?
Well, I'd only like to say that he's living in his own alternate reality, and the reality is that except for Donald Trump, if let's say a person comes into your house and offers you a terrific job, and another person comes into your house and at the point of a gun burglarizes you, you treat both the same way? China is basically stealing jobs from the United States and from different other countries. China is basically trying to become dominant, and that means overtake the United States. India is doing no such thing. So Donald Trump is the burglar and the friend he's putting on the same level. What has happened to all our decades of partnership with Washington? All gone. I mean, with the rains. And what has happened to decades of confrontation with China? Short of crawling, Donald Trump is doing everything he can to placate China. What is going on? I mean, he's living in a totally alternate reality. I was surprised. I'm sure the people in the UN General Assembly are very polite. The UN officials are very polite. They're not going to say anything. I mean, this man has cut funding drastically to the UN. He denies the whole concept of climate change. He says, no, there's no such thing. And, the fact of the matter is that the most ridiculous thing that he's doing is put India and China on the same footing. And I'd like to say that where Russia is concerned, well, oil will definitely find a market. And if India stops buying Russian oil, the Chinese will get oil at a cheaper price. So the Chinese will be able to outcompete the Americans much faster. I mean, doesn't Donald Trump realize that? Hasn't somebody showed him that memo? Obviously not. I think he doesn't look at memos. He looks at only his own alternate reality. And the reality of the situation is that the U.S. is losing friends, losing allies, losing support, and may I point out a faltering economy and high inflation. Donald Trump's speech talks of a strong economy, low inflation, and various other things that are just imaginary. And frankly, by putting India and China in the same camp, he's doing what the Europeans have been doing, which is essentially, drive Russia closer to China. I think as far as India is concerned, we are a security partner of the U.S. We are members of the Quad. We have signed the 4 foundation defense agreements, and these defense agreements are meant to protect the Indo-Pacific from, you guessed it, China. I don't see, why he's equating us with China. And I think, very frankly, I am rather surprised. I've always been a supporter of President Trump, right from 2015. This new avatar of President Trump surprises. I'd like to get the old Trump back as soon as possible. Thank you.
Professor Nalapat, we'll come back to you in just a minute. Let me also welcome on the show Meera Shankar. She's a former Indian ambassador to the United States and Germany. Thank you very much, ma'am, for taking the time out and speaking to us here on ET Now. We're discussing what Donald Trump has essentially stated at the UNGA, but in addition to attacking India once again on the back of oil tariffs, he's also stated that US is prepared to impose a strong round of tariffs, and he's also stated that he's hitting Brazil back very hard with tariffs. But the big question is, can Donald Trump stretch the imposition of tariffs any further, given the kind of backlash, the pushback that he's facing from countries?
Look, even if he were to really put higher tariffs on the goods that he has already put tariffs on, I think it won't make a difference, because at 50% tariffs, those exports will not take place. India will have to look for alternative destinations, And a lot of that is going to be impacted. So going from 50 to 75 is not going to make a difference in terms of the hard realities of the situation. Secondly, equating India and China, I think, is a bit problematic, given that India is a strategic partner of the United States. Our economies have not been in competition with each other. Our economies have been actually complementary to each other, building on each other's strengths and benefiting both sides. Finally, India is a member of the Quad and, has been one of the important dialogue partners of the United States for security and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific. So this whole business of not knowing, who your friends are and who your competitors are or who your adversaries are, I think is a serious problem today with U.S. policy and actually risks losing friends for the United States. Also, I think this desire to club India and China stems from the fact that the U.S. has been pussyfooting around China because they have leverage with the U.S., which they used by restricting the exports of rare earths and critical minerals, over which they have global dominance. And the U.S. was forced to walk back the 145% tariff that it had imposed on China. Since then, they have been very wary about talking about China, doing anything about China, and essentially they deal with it by putting India on the same plate and targeting India, which they think is a more manageable target. Rather short-sighted, because this is not going to impact Russia's policies with regard to Ukraine, which are driven by its own sense of its vital security interests. And secondly, if the major purchasers of Russian oil, China and EU, continue to be outside any kind of pressure, then why should Russia at all, look at halting the Ukraine conflict if it doesn't feel it's in its interest to do so? Nor has President Trump looked at any kind of secondary sanctions vis-a-vis Russia. Instead, what he said is, if Europe stops buying oil from Russia and imposes 100% tariffs on India and China, later he said only China on one occasion, then I will impose secondary sanctions on Russia, basically creating a situation where he doesn't have to impose them. So rather short-sighted. And then at the global level, the U.S. has been losing respect because they have been undermining global institutions, walking out of them, walking out of the climate change accord, reducing funding for the UN, reducing funding for the WHO, and in fact, creating a level.
Important point there, given what we have seen in terms of how this has panned out. But I just want to get your attention to also in tandem with what Trump has said, that they're using tariffs as a defense mechanism. And, when you're looking at the rationale behind this, given all that we've seen geopolitically speaking as well, how do you read into this?
Well, it's hardly a defense mechanism. It's actually being used for a variety of issues going well beyond trade. First of all, the WTO itself has been virtually gutted by these unilateral tariffs because it does away with the MFN principle. The U.S. has different tariffs for different countries as it pleases. Secondly, it looks not only at countries which have trade deficits, but with which it has trade deficits, but also trying to pressurize countries into economic decisions, buy U.S. oil instead of Russian oil. I think that's the longer-term objective of the U.S. as far as India is concerned, because that's what they did with Europe, in effect,
right,
using the Ukraine conflict to sever effectively Russia, EU, energy ties, which have been coming down but are still quite high, because the reality is that some of the countries like Hungary, Slovenia, the Czech Republic, etc., have carve-outs and are continuing to buy from Russia. So, and then also to actually force countries to align with U.S. geopolitical objectives. So I think he's using tariffs for a variety of reasons, including political peak in Brazil. They don't have a deficit with Brazil at all.
Absolutely, but it remains to be seen. Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. And it remains to be seen whether Donald Trump can actually use tariffs to arm twist countries into doing what he essentially wants. That remains to be seen. But for the moment, thank you very much, Ms. Shankar, for taking your time out and speaking to us here on ET Now. Always appreciate you speaking to us here on ET Now. Ladies and gentlemen, Donald Trump has made those comments, and essentially this is coming in at a time when Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, met with External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar, and he underlined once again the fact that the relationship that United States has with India is one of the most critical relationships in the world in this century. So how should his comments be read? Will his comments have a bearing on trade ties with India, given the fact that the Commerce Minister also happens to be in the United States? Will it have a bearing on these negotiations? That remains to be seen. But for the moment, it's time for us to take a very short commercial break. We'll be right back with lots more